Hi, everyone, and welcome to the kickoff episode of Letters to Alia, Your Stories, My Thoughts, on our Aligning Authenticity podcast, where we talk about all things mental health. I'm so excited to actually bring to you this segment. Submit your letters of a certain situation that you may actually be going through, and that can be in any area. So, whether that's going to be personal life or professional, we welcome all stories, okay? Feel free to put in a funny name or some sort of pseudonym so that you would know when your episode actually comes out. When you put in your email address, we send you an email and let you know when your episode is actually coming out. Okay, so moving on, our first letter comes from Confused Bestie, who's feeling a little bit guilty. So she has a friend who is cheating on her husband, and she also feels that she is worried that maybe her responses or the way that she's reacting to it is not strong enough. In the letter, she also shares about how she feels that she worries about how it may actually affect the kids. And at the same time, she's also feeling like she still wants to be there as a friend, to be able to support and listen to it. Yet at the same time, it's where she's feeling quite triggered. We may have actually faced such a situation ourselves in terms of telling a friend and wanting to be supportive of their decisions, yet it can be incredibly difficult to do so if we do not agree with some of the decisions that they are making. So let's talk about the emotional state first, okay? And Confused Bestie, if you are watching this, which I hope you are, then know that it is totally understandable and valid to feel what you feel. Okay, aside from the guilt, there might actually be other emotions that come up with it. For example, you might be feeling that sense of self-doubt, like, are you actually being a good friend or so? And this emotional state that we're in can have a part to play in terms of the actions we then take. For example, when we're talking about you feeling guilty, and feeling that sense of shame, that is what can also motivate us to keep on highlighting to this person that, hey, what you're doing is wrong. Don't you see that it's wrong? Those feelings of self-doubt can make us really question ourselves to see whether, like, hey, am I actually overstepping certain boundaries here? Maybe it's just none of my business. It's very important for us to recognize that these emotions really play a big part in terms of the actions, but also gives us a lot of room to learn a little bit more about ourselves. So we're not going to talk today about the morality of the situation, whether what the friend is doing is right or wrong. Okay, we're just going to focus a little bit more on how we can actually help Confused Bestie with her situation. For us to do that, we need to come from a space of understanding that there's only so much that we can actually do about a certain situation. You can highlight it a lot of different times to the person, but they may also choose to either take that feedback or not take that feedback. Let's talk about why these emotions come up in the first place for Confused Bestie. First is that you might actually feel that sense of guilt because you yourself might have quite some strong family values. So I'm not saying that your friend doesn't have the strong family values, but what I mean by that is that, let's say, especially if you yourself are a mother with kids, maybe you can't imagine putting your kids in that sort of situation. And that's why when you're looking at your friend going through this situation itself, it's like you just can't brain it. Aside from that, for some of us who might actually have experienced our parents going through certain episodes of infidelity or so, this can also trigger us to feel a certain kind of way, because at the time that those things might have been happening when we were kids, we also felt certain emotions. So when we're looking at other children that are going through that possible situation, whether they know it or not, just having that worry is very, very natural, for us to actually be concerned. Another reason why that guilt might also manifest is because we might also feel that sense of worry with it, where we worry about, like, hey, what happens when this person gets found out or the situation gets exposed? Are people then going to be thinking that I actually agreed with the situation? If people see that my friend is doing this kind of thing, they may think that I'm doing this sort of thing. So it doesn't really matter whether we are close to the spouse or not, but we might also have that concern, which is also very, very natural. A very important thing for us to remember as we are actually reflecting on these emotions is to know that it also comes from a space of love. Let's say it's someone else that you are not as close to. Perhaps you hear it as just a story and then you can kind of move on with your life. But when it comes to someone that we are very, very close to, it can be a lot harder for us to actually differentiate it. And you find that their problems in that sense become your own, where you also will start thinking and wondering about all of these different things, even though it's not you in that position. And that can also interplay with how we view ourselves as friends and how we may also view our friendships to be. Like, as a friend, should I not be giving this sort of advice to them or so? And maybe it is my own responsibility to make sure that this person changes their behavior, that this person actually takes in the feedback, takes in what I'm actually trying to tell them. Now, let's talk about what confused bestie can do about the situation. First is to remember that reflecting on our emotions, these different things that we talked about just now, it will give us a lot of insight as to why we are triggered by it. This is why recognizing our own emotions would be very, very powerful in helping us to deal with such challenging situations. Firstly, is because once we are actually able to really drill down to what we're feeling, so whether that's going to be the guilt or the self-doubt or so, then we can ask ourselves the deeper questions as to, one, why do I feel the way that I feel? Okay. And second is, what does that also tell me about myself? And you might find that as you are digging deeper into these kind of questions, that you learn a lot more about yourself. When we are aware of what our triggers are and why those triggers come up, we are actually better able to manage our actions after that. Because in this situation, confused bestie also feels like, oh, I've been telling this person and this person is not really taking it seriously. Should I then double down on my efforts? Should I be even stronger in it, stronger in the way that I'm actually communicating it? Because maybe then I can hook some sense into this person. As well-intentioned as we may be, and we try to tell them in a certain way, it doesn't matter whether we are doing it very assertively or aggressively. Sometimes we cannot control how the person might actually take in that message. And what happens with that, if let's say we keep on doing it, is that we also feel that heightened sense of frustration. We feel that, wow, this person just totally doesn't care what I think or whatnot, and then it spills over and becomes more of a friendship issue, when it doesn't really need to be. Here are some tips as to what confused bestie and perhaps we can also do if we find ourselves in this sort of situation. As I mentioned, the first thing that we can do is acknowledge our emotions without feeling guilty about it. It is completely natural to feel what we feel, and what we feel is actually very valid. Give yourself some space to process how it's really making you feel instead of suppressing your emotions. Because if you keep brushing it off or so, it will stack up on each other, and then you are likely to have maybe an explosion down the road or so, which is not ideal. Okay. And then the second one for us to actually do with that is to know where the line is for us. That's what we talk about when it comes to acknowledging and setting our own boundaries with it. At least in this situation, we're talking more about emotional boundaries. As much as you want to be her friend and support her through everything that she's going through, you can actually choose to compartmentalize the areas that you like to be there for your friend. So you could be there for her in all of these other aspects, like maybe when it comes to her other relationships with people, her other friendships, or even in terms of what she might be going through in work or whatnot. But you can also make it clear that, hey, when it comes to this area, I choose to not be as involved. For example, a phrase that you can actually use with that is, I don't feel comfortable discussing this. The third thing that you can do is to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. Your friend's choices are her own, and you are not responsible for whether she chooses to continue doing it or not continue doing it. We can care for them, but it's not our responsibility to actually fix or justify it for them. Like, okay, so maybe she's pouring out to you about it, every single instance that goes on, and she's actually looking for that sort of validation for you, right? This can also be very triggering for us, right? Because we do not necessarily agree. So if they're looking at us like, hey, what do you think about it? Do you feel certain, or what should I do about this situation? Then you can keep reminding yourself at the back of your mind that I don't have to agree or support this particular decision, but neither do I also have to be highlighting it each and every time to them. I'll also go into what are some of the key phrases that you can use to make it quite clear. We don't want to just suppress it. We want to communicate that in a way that is quite clear, yet it doesn't cause things to really escalate. The fourth thing that we can do is to reflect on our own values and the friendship, because sometimes it's only natural that as we are going through our different life stages and time, passes, our perceptions of our friends can also shift. And that can also be quite challenging sometimes, because maybe in your mind you viewed her as, or she would never do this kind of thing also, and then something like this happens. These things do happen, and you can still care about the person while you still disapprove of some of those choices. If you find that your friend is still very insistent on wanting to open up to you, or you feel that sometimes those boundaries are not really being respected, and it's causing you a lot of stress, or it makes you question the integrity of your friendship, it is also okay to have some distance. I'm just putting forward the perspective of us actually recognizing what we feel and communicating that, because it's very natural for us that the first thing that we do in such situations is we feel that we either need to distance or cut off from that friendship. And, I've seen in a lot of experiences where when people do that, when that is your go-to, there are so many lingering questions with it. And of course, you might still miss the person. So again, it is possible for us to actually still navigate our friendships while we are not always agreeing with every single thing that you're doing. Okay, we can still be friends, right? We just need to communicate that in a much more open manner. So last but not least is for you yourself, confused bestie, to engage in some self-care and manage these different emotions. So what we're talking about when it comes to managing these different emotions, like the guilt, feeling the burden of having to keep this secret, it can feel very heavy. So one thing that can help with that is journaling, which is always the go-to, that therapist, and even if you research online, this is one of the first few things that they recommend. Can also be helpful to talk to a therapist, because especially if you're worried that the secret might go out. Also, what if it becomes, such big news? It can also add that stress for us, because we feel like, wow, I have to keep this to myself, and I'm like going through all of these different emotions in my mind. So talking to a therapist can actually help you unpack it a bit further as to, okay, you feel a certain way, and what can you do about it, or what does it tell you about yourself? And then, once you have that emotional state again somewhat managed, it's a lot easier for us to control and adapt our different actions. I know that there can also be that feeling of like, oh, maybe I should tell the husband now what she's going through or what she's doing. So I would say that for that, it's different in different contexts. I'm not here to actually preach to you of like what you must do or you must not do, because life is not necessarily black or white in that way. If you are considering telling the husband about it, then really consider the consequences of those decisions and how it can affect things. We can still naturally just keep it clean. Okay, you've decided to do what you want to do. I've told you already that I do not approve. So even if the situation blows up or people find out about it, you know that you would have a much clearer mind that you've done your part during that point. You couldn't necessarily stop it, but you've already communicated what your stand is, that you do not agree. So it also lessens that feeling of when people kind of say these things out, like if they think that you actually agreed with what she was doing or whatnot. Okay, so just something to take note of. And let's say you've chosen to distance yourself from the situation. Okay, you do not have to cut ties completely, But you can choose how much time you want to spend engaging with this person, especially if they're talking about it 24/7, So, yes, just something to think about. What does engaging in self-care look like? Well, that is more of you really focusing on the things that bring you joy, that also help you manage the stress. Because when the situation is very draining, it can actually suck a lot out of us. You might find that even though it is not your situation, you're not the one that's doing these different things or so, but you find that it's always in your mental space. Like you wake up, you think about it, you go to work, you think about it, you come home, and then at night also you're thinking about it. That's when you know, like, wow, it is really taking up a lot of space. Focus on the things that bring you joy, whether that is time spent with loved ones or anything that basically helps you come back to your mental balance. That can be incredibly helpful. Make space for joy through the stress. So now we've talked about the emotions that come up with that and how that also leads to the different actions. And we've also talked about the different tips or methods of us handling it. Now, how do we actually communicate that to our friend who may actually be making this certain decision or so? Some of the key phrases that we can actually use is, for example, I care about you, but I don't feel comfortable being involved in this situation. Or another one is, I'm not judging you, but this is something that I'd rather not be a part of. A third one, which I find also quite useful, and especially, if we're not being passive aggressive in the way that we're saying it, is that this is your life, you're an adult with your own choices, but I don't think that I'm the right person to actually discuss this with. So, we're telling them that, hey, I'm still here for you in all of these other areas, just not in this. Okay. Some of the other things that we can also say to assure this friend that, hey, I'm still here for you as a friend. Even though maybe not in this situation, I still value our friendship. Or even if we are finding the situation quite challenging to process, right? And we want them to know. We want them to know that it actually affects us, okay? Not just them. I respect you as a friend, but I have to be honest. I'm finding the situation hard to process. Another one is, I always want the best for you, but I have to admit this puts me in a difficult spot. I'm struggling with this because I really value honesty and commitment in relationships. Another one that I also really like is, I don't want this to change our friendship, but I can't pretend it doesn't affect how I feel. A lot of those phrases that I've shared with you, they're I statements. They've started with the I, and you're telling them, okay, what you feel and how it's also affecting you. The benefit of using these I statements is where we're not trying to preach at them, and neither are we attacking them. Because sometimes when we are emotionally triggered, that tends to be the go-to. You notice that you're using more of the you statements instead of the I statements. So it'll be like, you make me feel this way. Don't you see what you are doing is wrong or whatnot? So the beauty of the I statements is where we're just saying that what you're doing in that sense is affecting me a kind of way. I feel a certain kind of way because of what's going on. And when we are actually tailoring it in that way, it helps make the situation a bit more objective. And again, they don't feel as attacked when we're telling them that. We're just being very honest in terms of how we are actually going through that experience, and it actually makes that feedback a little easier for them to digest and process. And you might be surprised that when you are saying it in that way, they're not as triggered when you are telling them that this is what is making you feel. When they have that space to actually think and process, they may also come up with newer insights. Like, so for example, they might be like, oh, wow, okay, so maybe I shouldn't be sharing about this situation with her. I should be more considerate as a friend and not bring her into my own issues. So we never know how that's going to be. Last thing that I like to say about, particularly when it comes to the context of relationships and marriages, we assume that we know the narrative. So we think that, okay, based on what you shared with me, I don't think this is acceptable, or why can't this just be resolved? Sometimes life is a bit funny, it's not always black or white. I find that for a lot of people who are actually going through these different situations, again, we're not going into the right or wrong, right? Morality aside, at least, when we're looking at that situation or that context, there's some things that would probably be lingering in the background. They might be telling you the story. You might think that it's a whole 100% of the story, but most of the time it never is, So I'm just trying to say that sometimes there could be some other things that's not really being exposed. It's also not our responsibility to go on this scavenger hunt or treasure hunt of information, right? Like, oh, I try to find out everything that I can about the situation or so, or what are you not telling me? That also adds a lot more stress, So as much as they share it with you, there could also be that part of them that is it is still concerned or worried about how we may actually perceive them, So they might tell us just about 60% of the story or so. It takes a long time before they actually tell you all parts of the situation, okay? But again, that is not always within your control about how much they want to share with you or not. I'm just coming from the perspective of it never is as straightforward. Most of the times where we feel like we don't really understand why they do what they do, we're probably right. you know, you might feel like, wow, you tell me this already. Why don't you tell me the whole story? We take it as it is because sometimes also that is the best way for us to actually provide that support for them. And if it is taking too much out of you, it doesn't mean that you are a bad friend or that you are a weak person. No, nothing like that. Okay. It's completely natural to feel what you feel. I hope that these tips and the walkthrough of this situation actually helps you confuse Bestie. And it's not an easy situation to navigate, but I hope that what we have discussed today gives you that fresh perspective as to how to navigate this situation. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. As I always mention to people, it's not easy for us to open up about these things. But again, it shows just how caring of a friend you are, that you have been thinking about this and that you want to help. Ultimately, you want to help and you still love your friend, And sometimes this, the strong feeling of not agreeing with what they are doing and that love that we have for them, these two emotions can coexist at the same time. So, yes, looking forward to receiving more of the letters, and do let us know in the comments if these tips have helped, or if you feel that there are other ways for us to actually tackle the situation, different perspectives that you might have about it. We hope to hear from you, and we look forward to receiving more of your letters. We hope this episode has helped, and see you in the next one.